her. She lost every battleground state. You yourself have criticized the Harris-Walz campaign for being too cautious. She may have told the American people, she may have warned the American people, but she didn't do it compellingly enough to win.
That is the absolute point. And look, when I criticize, I'm criticizing myself. I own this. I'm part of the ticket. And somebody has to come up with a strategy. I think this is exactly right. This is the thing. Look, Democrats, it was a good night in Wisconsin. I was over there. We saw that happen. Donald Trump's doing this. Just to be clear, nobody on the Democratic side is celebrating this, and those folks in the street are not celebrating that Donald Trump's making all these errors. I think what the vice president's saying is that was pretty self-evident that he was going to do that. I do think the challenge for Democrats, and this is, I think, a structural problem that's going to take a lot more thinking. Why, with all of that out there, did they not think we were any better than that? And they didn't.
The vanguard will be there.
Speaking of the Kamala Harris campaign, speaking of 2024 and how we can move on from here, we are still, you guys know us as Bernie Bros, but we also happen to moonlight as Walz Warriors. And we were very excited about Tim Walz's addition to the Kamala Harris campaign. I still think it was one of the best things that they did as an administration. I think that he's the most effective governor probably in all of America, and he looks a lot better than J.B. Pritzker right now after J.B. Pritzker did that god-awful veto in Illinois for legislation that, you guessed it, Tim Walz passed in Minnesota. He is the kind of guy that the Democrats need to be embracing, just like Bernie Sanders. He's been going across the entire country, speaking at town halls, really connecting with voters. And he was on Jake Tapper this Sunday. It wasn't just Bernie Sanders making the rounds on the Sunday shows. It was also Governor Tim Walz. He stopped by and reacted to Kamala Harris making an "I told you so" comment. Gavin, do you have anything to add before we play this clip?
Super excited to see this. I saw the moment that he's going to respond to, where Kamala's at this like conference or whatever she's speaking, and she kind of starts talking about, what Trump's been up to, and then she's like, I hate to say it, but I told you so. So I'm excited to hear what Tim Walz had to say about that, because he was a huge Kamala, he was a loyal VP. That's what I'm trying to say. He never once and has not up until this point thrown her under the bus or really been critical at all of anything she's done or anything she stood for. So it's going to be interesting to see if his honesty continues as we approach 2028, Zach, because I think what really is important here, the underlying issue is not just, the running mate dissed the top of the ticket or something like that. No, these could potentially be people who are running against each other in less than 4 years, Zach. They're both considered top contenders for the 2028 field if they decide to enter it.
100%. Let's definitely discuss that after we play this clip, because I think that is a great point that people are going to be really interested in discussing after we watch this.
Because, there were many things that we knew would happen. Many things. I'm not here, so I told you so.
What does "I told you so" really mean here? I mean, people heard her message. They did not vote for her. She lost every battleground state. You yourself have criticized the Harris-Walz campaign for being too cautious. She may have told the American people, she may have warned the American people, but she didn't do it compellingly enough to win.
Also, really quickly, not to jump in.
That is the absolute point. And look,
too quickly, the CNN site sucks. Sorry, it's not YouTube. But look at the sincerity on this man's face, and look at the just like performative laughter that came from Kamala Harris, right? What's Kamala up to now that she's lost this campaign as the head of the ticket, right? And where is Tim Walz? Just think for yourself.
It's kind of like how Obama recently came out to comment on the Trump administration. He's like, could you imagine, folks, if I had done 1/10 of this, what they would have said about me? It's like, bro, shut the fuck up. Stop making it about you. You're not the you know what I'm saying? It's like immediately just make it about me. Could you imagine what they would have said about me if I had 5 wives and if I had destroyed the economy? Like, dude, no one cares.
I couldn't even have some Grey Poupon on my cheeseburger. Wear a brown suit. I'm just a man.
I criticize, I'm criticizing myself. I own this. I'm part of the ticket. And somebody has to come up with a strategy. I think this is exactly right. This is the thing. Look, Democrats, it was a good night in Wisconsin. I was over there. We saw that happen. Donald Trump's doing this. Just to be clear, nobody on the Democratic side is celebrating this. And those folks in the street are not celebrating that Donald Trump's making all these errors. I think what the vice president's saying is that was pretty self-evident that he was going to do that. I do think the challenge for Democrats, and this is, I think, a structural problem that's going to take a lot more thinking. Why, with all of that out there, did they not think we were any better than that. And they didn't. And I'm very concerned with the folks who stayed home. And these are folks that I'll say once again, Donald Trump has identified their angst. They can't buy a house. They can't afford to get a good education. They're concerned that their economic future is so precarious it could slip out from under them. Less than half of Americans have $1,000 in savings. And I think, why was it not so compelling? It should have been a slam dunk for us to say, we're the party that cares about that. We're the party that's going to protect Social Security and Medicare. We're the party that thinks the ACA is a good start, but we need to do more on healthcare. And we didn't do that. So I'm concerned. Democrats do well in special elections and off-year elections, but the electorate that comes in presidential election years is different. When I was young,
That is such an incredible point from Tim Walz. Democrats have cleaned up a lot of times in midterm elections, but they do struggle with the electorate that is going to show up during the presidential election cycle, during these big monumental moments. The people that decided to stay home, who he also mentions right here, those are the people that the Democrats need to be going after. They need to be, winning over people on the margins, yes, but they need to be doing it with the message that Tim Walz laid out there. And I just love the fact that he's willing to be real. He's willing to take some accountability. He's going to say, we did not effectively make the case that we were going to be better than Donald Trump. We did not make the case effectively that we were going to take care of the economy. We did not make the case effectively that we were going to enrich people's lives. And so we lost to the guy who said that he was going to wreak havoc, the guy who was going to bring a wrecking ball to everything, the guy who was going to destabilize it all and burn it all to the ground, because that was a better idea to people than having a status quo manager like Kamala Harris. I think Tim Walz has learned so much from that failed run that he would be ready to wipe the fucking floor with Kamala Harris in a Democratic primary, as you alluded to, Gavin. Do you think that after giving a response like this, Tim Walz is potentially a front runner in the 2028 Democratic primary? And I just want to say, for everyone who's like, we can't talk about elections this early, we actually have to start talking about elections this early. This time around, we have no choice, because we have to make sure that there is a free and fair election in November of 2028. We need to make sure that Donald Trump is defeated and ousted from the White House, because if we're going to survive 4 years of Donald Trump, we cannot survive anymore.
Yeah. So I do agree. I think that, his comments still very respectful. He includes himself. He's like, I think we should take a look at what happened to the ticket. And obviously I'm part of the ticket. So it's not like he's totally cutting himself out of the blame. It's not like he's solely putting the blame at Kamala's feet, but I do think he's kind of trying to push back on that energy of the I told you so, and be like, no, instead of saying I told you so, instead of essentially blaming the American voter, let's take a look at why we didn't tell them so good enough. Like, how did we tell them? Was it the proper way to communicate that? What could we have done differently? And I think that's an interesting approach to this. I think it's healthy. And I do think he's definitely one of the top contenders for 2028 if he decides to run, which I think he certainly will. Here's what I'm a little bit worried about, though, Zach. Tim Walz is such a nice guy. He's so polite, as we even saw in that, comment. He couldn't just criticize Kamala in the campaign. He had to be like, and I'm also to blame. Trust
I don't appreciate it.
Yeah, exactly. So he's so nice. Here's what I'm a little bit worried about. Say Kamala also runs in 2028. I think he still would feel a little bit, I think he would feel kind of like, almost awkward or embarrassed, because like he probably feels like she elevated him to even be in that contender status by picking him as her VP. So then for him to run against her in the primary, I kind of worry we'd run into some of that Bernie energy where he couldn't quite put the knife in Joe Biden, where he would be unable psychologically to really be honest, truly, to her face at a debate about the ways in which she failed, and to point that out so the American people could understand it, so the Democratic voter base could really understand and in an undeniable way, because that's what we need. We need someone like Tim Walz to come up there and say, hey, I tried my best to make this thing work, but it ain't gonna fucking work. And we have to do something different. That means not choosing Kamala Harris again. That means choosing me because of my agenda, my record, and my progressive accomplishments in Minnesota, not being a fucking cop for my whole life, right? I just don't think he can do that. I'm really worried.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. And I was sitting here before you said that thinking, I think a lot of the qualities that Tim Walz has, kind of reflect that of a Jimmy Carter kind of a guy that could do really well in an election after you have just this ogre archetypal bad guy, right? So the only reason that Jimmy Carter was able to win in the aftermath of Richard Nixon was because of the Watergate scandal, right? So he beat Gerald Ford, right, for re-election. and it was this whole ordeal. And he was a one-term president, but he was a peanut farmer. He was the governor of Georgia. He was a likable, down-to-earth guy. He spoke candidly. He wanted to do good things for the American people. He was a deeply religious guy. We could talk all day long until we're blue in the face about the missteps he made in office, but that was kind of the appeal of him when he was running, right? But then I thought about, as you were talking right there about, that lack of a killer instinct, the Hunter S. Thompson famous quote about Jimmy Carter, where he said that he was one of the 3 meanest men that Hunter Thompson ever met in his life in terms of functional meanness, in terms of you're standing in my way and I'm trying to get from point A to point B. I am mean as fuck on my way. He talked about it always either Sonny Barger, the founder of the Hells Angels, Muhammad Ali, and then Jimmy Carter. So a mean son of a bitch, right? I think that wherever that is inside of Tim Walz, if he wants to be president, you're right. He has to find that reptile brain. He has to find that killer instinct. He has to be able to embody the attack dog. And I think he has it in there somewhere. Whatever he found in him that made him a football coach, that made him the defensive coordinator, that made him a guy that wants to fight for his family's future, that made him want to fight for Minnesota family's future. He has to dig deep and find out because, the American people, they do want a strong leader. They don't want a pushover. So he has to thread the line between being, I am a friendly, Midwestern dad, potentially on the way to being grandpa aged. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm affable. I'm trustworthy. I want what's best for the country. I'm here to get us back on track. But you also have to have the killer instinct that's like, okay, I'm going to be able to pull the trigger. And for the American people, they want a guy that they think can lead us to war, right? That's not something that I really consider when I'm looking for an American president, but to the rest of the population, it is.
Yeah. So it's going to be really interesting because I do worry that, a bunch of Democrats just kind of like fall in line because, it's like, she told us and she was right. And now she's vindicated. So it's her turn now. Like, I do worry that will happen or, that they'll, now it's Pete Buttigieg's time or some shit. And we really need these more progressive candidates to stand up and draw a line in the sand and be like, I respect you, Mayor Pete, but we're not the same. I'm what this country needs. You're fucking not. That's what we need. Because a lot of people, they don't necessarily know what separates a Tim Walz from a Pete Buttigieg. And I think that's really one of the other big fatal flaws and tragic mistakes of the Kamala campaign. Like, people talk about all these mistakes they made. One of the big mistakes they made, in my opinion, was not really educating people as to the accomplishments of Tim Walz. Like, I don't think Tim Walz likes to brag, so he didn't want to just go out there and brag constantly, but they should have honed in on that more instead of just talking about like everything else he'd ever done, from being a coach to serving in the National Guard or whatever. Like, they should have talked about what he fucking delivered for Minnesota, because the actual wins on a policy level so much outweigh what other Democratic contenders are responsible for, right? You can actually point to a list of serious things that he did for Minnesota, and then they could have said, that's what we're going to do for you guys nationwide. We're going to do in America what Tim Walz accomplished in Minnesota. And that's what he needs to do more so than ever going forward. Like, really associate himself with a list of policies in the way that Bernie did with Medicare for all, in a way that Trump, frankly, did with the border wall and with tariffs and yada, yada, yada. Like, Tim Walz needs to be known for and associated with his accomplishments in Minnesota, not just being the guy who can make the like fucking tater tot hash brown bake, right? And we'll hang out in the cheesy shirt or something. Like, no, I feel like they lean a little bit too into the like wholesome Walz thing. Like, that's not really ultimately his appeal. His appeal is that he has that like FDR Bernie style progressive vision, sweeping progressive vision. And that's what he should hone in on. And if people know that about him, I think he can beat the Gavin Newsoms of the world, the Pete Buttigieg's of the world, and the Kamala Harris's.
Do you think that there's any chance that because of their overlap in universal policy instincts, for example, some people were asking in chat, what was Tim Walz able to accomplish when he was governor? Well, he had a 1-seat majority in Minnesota. He was able to legalize cannabis. He was able to give all kids free school breakfast and lunch.
Paid family leave.
Paid family leave. I believe he raised the minimum wage while he was in office.
I think so.
Or at least the minimum wage went up in the state of Minnesota. I don't know if
there was a big list being circulated around. I'm not from Minnesota, so I don't remember all of them, but he had a list that was far more impressive than any other fucking governor.
And it was a 1-seat majority in a purple state in the Midwest, in the heart of flyover country. Do you think that there would be a chance for us to see Tim Walz and Bernie Sanders start to collaborate, right? I know Bernie Sanders likes to march to the beat of his own drum. I love Bernie Sanders. He's an independent, and he is for sure a leader, right? Bernie Sanders is not interested in playing second fiddle too much at this stage of his career. But I do think it would be monumental for Bernie Sanders and Tim Walz to go out somewhere together and be like, this is the future of the Democratic Party. We have to confront these issues head on, and we have to confront them with real solutions that are going to deliver for the American people. This is our wake-up call. Tim Walz is with us fighting the oligarchy. Tim Walz is going to, say that we need to overturn Citizens United, adopt a couple of key Bernie policies, introduce some new policies. As Gavin said, he needs to have some flagships of his own. He can talk about how he's going to accomplish it the same way he did when he was governor, with a narrow majority, because he's a shake your hand politician. He's a, hey, let's get this done. Hey, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to whip votes. I'm going to be able to actually move people's opinion because I'm a likable guy. That's the other thing that we have to talk about with Tim Walz. He was liked by pretty much everybody in Congress, right? Even Nancy Pelosi had nice things to say about Tim Walz, and their politics are very different as far as the parameters of the Democratic Party goes. He's the kind of guy that has made connections. He's shaken a lot of hands, and he could deliver for the American people. And I think it would be smart for Bernie Sanders to kind of add some credibility to this guy who's a little younger than him.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to see that. It would be sick to see him show up at one of these rallies. And like I said, I just want the actual progressive faction of the Democratic Party to make it known that they are separate and different from like the Pete Buttigieg, Gavin Newsom, and Kamala faction. So yeah, I think that Tim Walz should make it clear that, like, out of those two factions, I'm more in the Bernie camp. I'm more in the populist progressive camp than the neoliberal status quo manager camp. Because, again, I do think a lot of Americans, sadly, when they're presented with Tim Walz on the campaign trail as running mate, they didn't realize what they were being offered there. They kind of just thought, oh, this is another old white guy who likes football and hot bake or whatever. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, they didn't really realize that they were dealing with a Bernie or FDR style Democrat in Tim Walz. So I think that, yeah, more so than being like the Midwest nice dude or whatever, he should hone in on this. He should be like, yes, I'm with Bernie. I'm not with fucking Gavin Newsom. I'm not going to endorse Kamala Harris if she runs again. We need an actual progressive overhaul of this fucking party, of its vision, because, you know, what AOC is talking about, what Bernie are talking about, that's what the Democratic Party should stand for, not what Chuck Schumer is talking about, and not, you know, Kamala Harris cackling at the masses telling them, I told you so. That's not the energy we need. We need to fight the oligarchy, not go out there and speak for some insanely high talking fee at a bunch of rich people and tell everyone about how I told them so. Like, no, these are very different things. I hope that Tim Walz, and maybe he can be a good bridge candidate, honestly. Maybe that is his ultimate appeal. That was a big part of my analysis in the beginning as to why he would make a good VP pick. I guess that didn't turn out to be correct, but you know, I always thought he made for a good bridge candidate between those two factions, between the more establishment progressives. At this point, I do think it's important that he straight up declares, I'm a progressive. You know, I'm on this side of things. If I run in 2028, it's going to be as a dramatic enforcer of a progressive vision, a revolutionary message to really remake this party in a different image, because that is what the Democratic Party needs. And yeah, I think that if he started to show up at some Bernie rallies, like along with AOC, that could really cement what we've been talking about for a while, Zach, which would be our ultimate fantasy of Tim Walz and AOC running on the same ticket in 2028 after obviously potentially a pretty messy primary. But we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm definitely keeping my eye on AOC getting into the Senate race in New York in 2028. I think that that's probably where she goes as far as my money is concerned, but I would love to see her collab with Tim Walz. And we have a few minutes or about 30 seconds left of this that I want to play for everybody, because I just think it is so obvious this man is a progressive at heart. He needs to seize this moment.
Off your elections. But the electorate that comes in presidential election years is different. When I was young, it was easy to know what a Democrat was. They stood with the working class and labor. Republicans were country club and for the rich. Today, you ask people, they don't. We have a 29% approval rating.
Yeah.
It doesn't help us any that Donald Trump ends up with a 25% approval rating. We have to get back to the core issues, that this is about making America prosperous and stable and innovative for everybody.
Look out the door if you hear an ambulance. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be